Hello, and welcome to the So You Want to Be a Marine Biologist podcast, where we learn about the ocean, share sea stories, and explore ocean careers. I'm your host, Kara Muzia. Let's dive into today's episode. Howdy, mermaids, pirates, ocean lovers, and land lovers. My guest today is Andrew Lewin, a marine biologist, conservationist, and oceanpreneur. Andrew has founded the Speak Up for Blue network and communications, where he educates people on ocean careers, news, and how to live a more ocean-friendly life. He also hosts the Speak Up for Blue and Marine Conservation Happy Hour podcasts, among others. In this episode, we learn how a landlocked Canadian applies to over 400 jobs and lands one working in the Gulf of Mexico, why he decided to go back and get his master's degree, even though he already had a cool job, and how Andrew is still able to be a marine biologist even though he doesn't live anywhere near the ocean. Andrew's story illustrates how when you can get creative and step out of your comfort zone, magical things can happen. Here's Andrew. Hey, Andrew. Thank you for being on the So You Want to Be a Marine Biologist podcast, and welcome.
Thank you. I'm excited to be here.
Awesome. So for listeners, Andrew Lewin is my guest today, and he is the host for the Speak Up for Blue podcast, among others. And I definitely want to chat more about that later. But first, you were a marine biologist. What inspired you to become a marine biologist in the first place?
Well, as many people would probably say, I was fascinated with the ocean from a young boy. I grew up in Ontario, and I never really got to see even the Great Lakes a lot when I was a kid. We'd go to the beaches every once in a while, but I never really realized how great or how big they were. But I always just fantasized about the ocean. And then once, there was more TV programming available to me. I just kind of watched these not only Discovery, but like Jacques Cousteau, and these wonderful BBC episodes that we used to get in Canada. And it was just fascinated me. I was like, I want to be in tropical waters. I want to be swimming with dolphins. I want to study sharks and all that kind of stuff. Just kind of drove my passion for marine biology. So ever since I was a young kid, when I was in grade 9, I knew I wanted to be a marine biologist, but it happened before that too.
Were you able to go to the ocean often, family trips, or just studying Jacques?
My first time to the oceans when I was 9 years old. We took a trip down to Florida, and we did Disney, and then we did St. Petersburg, Florida. Or Clearwater Beach, sorry. And it was wonderful. I was in the water all the time, looking at starfish, looking at sand dollars. It was just, it was epic for me. And that just kind of solidified my need to be in the ocean even more.
All right. So you are in high school and you're applying to colleges, and I did some researching on the webs, and you went to Acadia University. What made you choose that? Because you knew you wanted to be a marine biologist going in.
Yeah, well, that's where I did my master's. So I actually did my master's at Acadia, which is in Nova Scotia, which makes sense because it's by an ocean. My undergraduate degree was at the University of Guelph, which is in like central Ontario. Not much water around, especially in ocean. But we had a great marine biology program there. There was a lot of like Canadian known marine biologists that were there. We had one of the most prominent ichthyology labs at the university. So it was just one of those compelling things. It was an hour away from home. So it was nice to be close to home and learn about marine biology at the same time. At one point, they did have like seals and a dolphin for studying in captivity. Obviously, they got rid of that once they realized that wasn't a good thing for them. And then and we used to go to field trips. Like we used to do like classes away. So there's almost like one of those experiences, and we'd go to Huntsman Marine Lab, which was in St. Andrews, New Brunswick, right by the water. So it was actually called St. Andrews by the Sea, and it was a wonderful marine lab there. We got to go out in the ocean a number of times, and that was my first time on a boat doing research in the ocean was when I was 21. And so not a lot of experience on the water for sure in university. And so after my undergraduate, I decided, I got to find a job. And I worked locally as a technician as a wetland technician here in Toronto, where I grew up, and I did that for about 6 months. That contract ran out, and I had to work, and I had to find a job. So I was looking for a job, and I was working at an aquarium store in the meantime. And man, the next 6 months before I found the next job were insane. I think I put out 400 resumes before I found a job. I mean, I applied to everything, right? So I graduated with an undergraduate degree, and I applied for positions that I shouldn't have been applying for, master's, PhD. I was like, no, I can do that kind of stuff. One of them, I think, you had to have an MBA. I didn't even know what an MBA was. I was like, I can do that. Like, that's no problem. And it was just like a lot of them I shouldn't have even applied for, but I did, because I was like, I just want to be in marine biology. That's all I want to do. Just want to do marine science and conservation. And then I got this job at LUMCON, which is the Louisiana University's Marine Consortium, and it's at the tip of southern Louisiana. And I was a marine technician on that boat. And that was probably one of the best jobs I've ever had. I was out in the water probably for about 8 months, on and off. We would have researchers come on from all over the country, all over the world, and they would do their studies, including the Mississippi plume study, the hypoxia study, or the hypoxia study. So we would do a lot of like dissolved DO, sort of dissolved oxygen measurements along a number of sampling points. They did a few trips through the year in one big 2-week-long trip. Which was fascinating to be a part of, because at that point I'd never really been a part of a lot of experiments, a lot of studies. And that was a great introduction to just what different researchers were doing and the type of research that they were doing. And I got to interact with all of them. I would be the liaison.
What was your role on the boat?
So mine was actually looking after all the instrumentation that we had, oceanographic instrumentation. So the CTDs, the acoustic Doppler systems that we had 2 of those. We had air quality. We had a flow through system, a surface flow through system, and there was a lot of instrumentation. Like, it would take temperature, salinity. There was a fluorometer on there, so it would take chlorophyll levels. There's just a number of different instruments that were set up. So my job was to make sure that everything was running.
Okay.
And the funny thing is, I had no business being at that job at the beginning, because you almost needed like an electronic engineer degree just to handle any kind of instrument that would break down. You had to fix it, because you're on the water. You had to fix it. I had like all the toys and backups to all the toys, and I would just swap them in and out, and I would learn on the job. And it was one of the hardest jobs I've ever done, because when an instrument's broken down and somebody's paid $5,000 a day to be on this ship, they want to make sure that they're going to get their CTD cast. And if you're not doing it properly, they're not going to be happy. So you got to make sure you're on it. So I was always studying. I was always looking up stuff, and always busy, sometimes working like 36-hour shifts if I had to. It's a tough job, but probably one of the best jobs, because you're on the water most of the time. And it was just something, as 22 years old, I wanted to be on this water, and it was, I had quite the number of experiences which made it a lot of fun.
Hey, Kara here. I hear it all the time. How do I become a marine biologist? Or my niece wants to help the ocean. Where does she even start? I hear from students, yes, and also nurses, HR professionals, and other mid-career folks who wonder if they could still make their dream of working with sea turtles or sharks come true, wondering if it's too late to answer the ocean's call. Here's what I've learned after 20 years in the field and hundreds of interviews. There's no straight line, no magic degree, and no gatekeeper. You create the path forward. If this sounds overwhelming and vague, I've created 2 tools to help you stop wondering what if and start moving forward with clarity and purpose. The first is my free guide, Be a Marine Biologist Without the Degree. Over 1,000 people have already downloaded this guide and taken their first step towards ocean impact. Inside, you'll find 7 concrete, doable actions to help you get started, whether you're just exploring or ready to make a change. Then there's the Ocean Blueprint. This is a 30-day self-paced course that helps you build your unique path into ocean science and conservation without quitting your job or going back to school. Inside the Ocean Blueprint, you'll get daily prompts to explore your interests, skills, and next steps, a structure that turns overwhelm into real momentum, and a bonus section to root your work into Ocean Connection. You don't have to wait for a degree, a perfect plan, or permission. Whether you're wading in or ready to take the deep dive, these tools are here to help you move from dreaming to doing. The ocean called. Are you ready to answer? Links in the show notes and on my website, karagracemusia.com. I can't wait to see the waves you'll make. Yeah, that's special to be able to get that true hands-on science field experience fairly right out of college. But you kind of threw out some lingo that people may not be familiar with. So
Yes.
CTDs and Dopplers. CTD, it stands for conductivity, temperature, and depth. And when you're studying hypoxia, which is the lack of oxygen in water systems, it's kind of important to know these parameters. And they're really common in most research, actually, to know those specific parameters so that you know what the water is doing. Even if you're studying like seagrass or dolphins, people want to know what the water quality is like. And then Doppler, that's just sound, right?
Right. Yeah, I was almost looking at wave direction. It was measuring wave direction and speed actually with these types of Doppler systems, and they're really cool. We had two of they're called transducers, the actual instruments, and they were put into the hull of the boat, and they were on the bottom of the instrument was facing the bottom of the boat, and they'd actually be in the water. And it would be hooked up to my computer system, my whole network of computer system, which I also had to learn how to network computers, especially when chief scientists, PIs would come on and want to, tap into the network. And so yeah, it was really interesting learning those instruments. The CTD casts were quite amazing because we'd have scientists that would come on and they would do, they want to do Sargasso Sea studies. And so that meant that they want to see where the Sargasso Sea met the Gulf of Mexico water. So we would do CTD casts 1,000 feet, 3,000 feet. And what we would see is, you'd see the salinity from as if ever people have studied marine biology, you would see the salinity start to drop and just kind of maintain a certain amount as you go deeper and deeper in the water. But when you find a water body that has kind of come in a new current system, like the Sargasso Sea, which is very, very high in salinity, you'll get that extra bump. So when you're 1,000 meters down and you find where that new plume is, that water current is, it's kind of cool to see that jump after, sometimes it takes like a half an hour to an hour to get down that far. And you're just kind of watching just nothing on the screen. And then all of a sudden this big blip being like, yeah, we found it. And then you could actually take water samples with the stroke of a key. You can take water samples at different depths. So it's kind of for someone who's young and just out on the ship and loving life and doing these types of work, and being able to use this instrumentation, understand it, felt pretty good. Good at the time, I have to admit.
That's awesome. It's a really cool experience. CTDs are a very valuable scientific tool, and you got to firsthand experience with it.
Oh yeah.
So what inspired you to decide to go back to grad school then? Because you got a job, you were getting experience. Like, why go back?
I think it was actually interacting with the PIs, the chief scientists that would come on our ship. They were doing all this wonderful research, and I was helping them collect it, which was fun. But I knew in the future I want to be part of that research. I really enjoyed doing research. I still do, to be honest. I really enjoy the whole setting up studies and using the scientific method to prove or disprove hypotheses.
You like the true science of it.
I love the true science of it. It was a lot of fun. So I was like, well, the next step is to do a master's. So it was actually a funny story. I contacted a professor of mine for my undergraduate work, and we had this independent study in my last year of undergrad, my fourth year, and I did this presentation. It was on looking at, if I remember correctly, it was looking at the effects of skate reproduction. It had to do something with, I forget the exact, but it had to do with skates, so like stingray skates, like that kind of thing. And he mentioned
rollerblades. You weren't looking at rollerblades.
No, not skating that kind. I know I'm Canadian, but not that kind of skating. No, but essentially, what he made a comment during my presentation that we didn't really know oceanography because we weren't really taught it in our undergrad.
Okay.
Just the way it's at the time he was making sort of a jab at the program that we weren't fully, learning this kind of stuff because it just wasn't in the curriculum. But I took it as an insult that I was up there. So he was telling me I didn't know this in front of all of my colleagues, my fellow students. So I always had like a little bit of a gripe with him. And then I realized when I was down in Gulf of Mexico, he was right. I didn't know any of this, and I was learning it on the job. So what do you do when you want to get the attention of a professor? Is you tell him he was right. And so I did that. I emailed him. I said, you know what? I told him the situation. I said, I always had a gripe against you because of it. And then I realized now that you're right, and I want to study with you to do a master's. Well, that compliment worked, and we started talking. And originally he was at University of Guelph, and then when I went to look at applying there, he actually got a new job. He was the environmental chair. He got a new position, environmental chair at Acadia University in Nova Scotia, Wolfville, Nova Scotia. So he said, hey, Andrew, do you want to follow me out there? And I said, absolutely. I said, it's a great opportunity to do this type of work, be in Nova Scotia. And so I did. I just kind of, my wife now, girlfriend at the time, we decided to go and explore and have a new adventure while we were young. So it was a lot of fun.
What did you study while you're in grad school then? You got your hands-on oceanographic experience.
Yeah, well, actually, it was my thesis. It was a research thesis, and my thesis was on looking at the size and number of marine protected areas that would go on the Scotian shelf, so Nova Scotian coastline, for macroinvertebrates. So that would be crabs, lobsters, shrimp, squid, anything that was like a large invertebrate, especially that was commercially important species.
And marine protected area means completely off limits from fishing, or was there limited allowances?
Well, it would depend. So these were not actually designated marine protected areas. So my thesis was part of a larger project from World Wildlife Fund in Eastern Canada. They were looking at putting a network of marine protected areas. They were working with the government of Canada, the federal government of Canada, to put a network of marine protected areas in place. So they were looking at a lot of different components. So there was demersal fish, there was marine mammals, there were sea turtles, there were sharks, large, you got your large fish, seabirds, all sorts of things. So there was a lot of different components. Mine was like a smaller component of that project. So there hadn't been a marine. There was one marine protected area that was designated that was more of a special area. It was a big canyon, and so there wasn't anything else there. So what they wanted to do is they were looking at what would be what would be the areas that would be up for candidacy for marine protected areas, especially if you're looking at a large network. And the way I always tell people to picture it is think of the Great Barrier Reef. The Great Barrier Reef is as long as the west coast of the United States. A lot of people don't even realize that when you look at it. And there are multiple, what we call MPAs, but multiple management areas within that large MPA, that Great Barrier Reef Marine Park. And there's some that are open to divers, and scuba and snorkelers. There are some that are open to fishing. There are some that are open to just scientists, and there's some that are no take and no access to anybody, including scientists. So there's it's multi-level management. That's what this overall project was looking at how we can put multiple management areas, multiple zones, if you will, in this one large MPA. And it had to do with you pick small areas that took up about 20 to 30% of the area in total, but that were biologically connected, meaning, if you wanted to protect crabs, say, you want to make sure that the larvae from crabs up in the northern part would actually reach down to the southern parts. And it would actually be, some areas would be a sink for larvae, like crab larvae that was coming in from the currents above, or vice versa. So that hadn't been done yet, but we were setting it up. To do that, we had to find as much data as possible and put it all together to put it in this model called MarkSand. And to be honest, the explanation of that would be an entirely different podcast. But it's essentially this model that you would do that would choose multiple configurations of candidate areas for this MPA, this large multiple zone MPA.
Okay.
So it gets complicated, but mine was like a simple part. It was okay, we have this stock assessment data that for about 4 years because they only started collecting macroinvertebrates, commercially important macroinvertebrates, for 4 years. So what we were looking at is saying, okay, are there assemblages of macroinvertebrates, so communities of invertebrates that would be in the same area, consistently? So stuff that we expected to be there. And what would those areas be dominated by? So some areas would be dominated by lobster, some areas would be dominated by crab, and some areas would be dominated by a specific species of shrimp. It just depended. And that area would grow and shrink as depending on the year. And then every once in a while, there's one year I remember, because it was only 4 years, but there was one year that I remember where all of a sudden squid came in, and they were a Gulf of Mexico species, but they came in through the Gulf Stream. And they only lasted a year because the next year they were all gone. So these assemblages changed. And so what we did is we said, okay, let's look at, the buffer area where, it grows and shrinks. And let's look at the core area that always stays the same. And we said, that's where the MPA should be located, somewhere in here for, the specific, management area for macroinvertebrates. So that's what I did. And we also looked at diversity of the banks. So along the East Coast, there are a lot of different banks, which are basically, large mountains or hills underwater that have a high diversity of species. And so we looked at how close it was to reaching the maximum number of species. So it was kind of cool. It was a fun project. I had to learn GIS, so Geographic Information System, which is like a digital mapping software. Also, it's a database, a location-based database that's used in almost every workplace, not only in science, but even in business. And so I had to do a diploma for that as well, which was interesting to do. So 8 months of that, and then 1 year of my master's. I combined them both because I did it during those 2 years. And then I was in and out of that master's program. I think I was the fastest one to do it, my professor said, which I don't think the school loved, but they actually built a program after I left. So it was a program where you would do a 8-year diploma at the college there, the community college, which was one of the best programs. There was one of 3 programs in Canada. That was one of them. And then you would do a master's the next year, and it would be 2 years, and then you'd do some field work, and then you'd be out, or you'd defend if you wanted to.
Wow.
So yeah. Sorry, that was a lot. Apologize.
Yeah. No.
but that's what I did for living in Halifax.
Cool. So you did this research on marine protected areas. What came of it?
That's a good question. So this is where my career gets complicated. So the idea was to work. My idea growing up was to work along a coastline. Obviously, you're a marine biologist. You want to work along a coastline. But at the time, as I mentioned earlier, my girlfriend moved out. She's now my wife. And she was someone who grew up in Ontario, just like me, but was very close to her family. I'm very close to my family, but they knew that I was going to be moving away. My girlfriend at the time, my wife now, said, hold on a second. I've always thought that we were going to stay in Ontario. So obviously there was a bit of a problem here with what we were going to do. So I said, well, look, let's just, go 2 years out for my master's, 2 to 3 years, and then we'll come back to Ontario for 2 years. And the reason why I proposed that was I met people at LumCon they were couples, and they were both marine biologists, and they both had different areas of expertise. But, when you're both marine biologists, you're not always going to get the same job at the same place. So what they would do is one would get a job, they would stay there for 2 to 3 years, get that experience. And then the other one would look for a job there. They would probably work maybe something different than they would normally work at. But then 2 to 3 years later, they would get a job somewhere else, and they would move through that. So
I actually had a marine biology couple on the show, Emily Cunningham and Dan Moore, and they do something very similar.
Yes, I've met Emily Cunningham. I believe she was on the podcast.
They're lovely.
Yes, they're awesome. Yeah. So that happens a lot in marine biology. So I told my wife, I was like, well, we can do the same thing. I come out here for 2 or 3 years to Nova Scotia. You come with me, and then we go back to Ontario for 2 to 3 years, and then we'll see what happens. We'll see what happens ended up both of us staying here. We got married, had a family, 2 lovely young girls, and I've been here ever since. And it's been a struggle for my career, to be honest, to find something in marine biology. I've probably made the most of it to be a marine biologist in in Ontario, I went to environmental consulting for about 10 years. And one of my first jobs was environmental consulting, but it was more freshwater. So it was all around. So consulting a lot of times is around industry. So I was working with clients of ours that were for the group that I worked with, that were mining companies, and we would make sure that they would, follow the regulations that were set out by the federal government. And so and it was a lot of scientific study. So we had to do a lot of scientific study. So I would come up with a study design. We would sell that study design to the client, and then we'd actually implement that study design. So it was kind of great in terms of it still had that pure research. And it was a lot of new stuff that hadn't been done before. It was just in freshwater bodies. And I was fine with that.
To be, it still has a conservation aspect to it.
Absolutely.
You're regulating.
Absolutely. And actually, to be honest, we were working for the clients, but also with the government to make sure that they're following it. But we're also challenging the government on a lot of things too, in terms of the type of statistics that they were using. I remember doing a presentation at a conference up in Sudbury, Ontario, where I talked about one of the, looking at univariate stats versus multivariate stats, and the benefits of using multivariate stats when we look at assemblages of it was a lot of benthic work.
You are getting really
I'm getting really specific.
Technical. So
yes.
Can you break down what each of those stats mean?
Yeah, for sure. Well, the univariate stats are a set of tools that look at one parameter. So it would be like a generalization. So you're looking at, like, say something like species diversity. And there's a lot of metrics for diversity. There's the actual number of species, and then there's a couple of other models that you can put together that are like indices of diversity. It gets confusing when you're doing that because you're summing up all the data into one metric to give people an idea of what the diversity is. And my argument with that was it takes away some of the information, and it doesn't give you the full picture. It wasn't a true representation of what we were doing. So what I wanted to do is the stuff that actually I learned in my master's was using multivariate stats, which is more about looking at assemblages. So how are the communities of invertebrates that we were looking at? These were smaller invertebrates, but how are the communities of invertebrates structured, and how are they different? So when you do a study with like a mine, and there's discharge, there's effluent, there's water that's like, you can almost consider like, once they use the water to do their processing of the mine, of the minerals, that water, that effluent, that sort of like wastewater is put out back into the river. So it has to be of a certain quality before it goes back out into that river. So what the government wanted us to do was to check to make sure that upstream communities were the same as the downstream of where this effluent was coming out. So you would look, so that there's a pipe that comes out with the mining water, and then you would look upstream of that to make sure that's the area that is not affected by the mine water. And then you would look at two areas downstream of that water, so maybe affected or in the area of that water.
That seems to make sense, right?
Yeah, it made sense. And you would look at that, and then what I noticed was there's differences between the univariate stats and the multivariate stats, meaning that when you lose some of that information in an index, it can give you a false positive compared to, like, a false positive meaning that there could be a change or a difference between the reference site and the downstream sites. And then so when you use the multivariate stats, it shows there's no difference. So there was a little bit of a controversy there. So it was nice to be able to sort of push that a little bit, and to say, hey, this is what we're looking at here. There's something wrong here. And they took it very well. At first they weren't very happy about it because, they had it all in their regulations and it was all part of the law, but they took it very well. And other companies started to use that same kind of method to make sure that it was important, because, the clients have to pay a lot of money to clean up the water. You want to make sure that it's a true thing of that they have to do. So I got to do stuff like that, which was great. I moved companies after that, and I went to a company that did more marine stuff. They were based in Ontario, but they had satellite offices, one in Alaska, one in Texas, one in Newfoundland in Canada. And so I was.
So your younger self was doing a happy jig. Yay, marine stuff.
I was like, this is amazing. I get to work. They do a lot of work with whales and acoustics, especially around the oil and gas industry. I was like, this is awesome. Down south in Texas, they worked in the Gulf of Mexico a lot. I was like, This is great. I have experience in the Gulf of Mexico. And I was actually working as a GIS analyst. So this digital mapping diploma that I got really worked out as being really employable for me, because that's how I got the job. And I was able to do mapping of like huge databases of whale sightings. So that was kind of cool. And I got to do some analysis on like, okay, if so we were looking with bowhead whale. So as an example, we were looking at bowhead whales migration routes. They migrate from the Western Beaufort in Canada west to Alaska. And in Alaska, there's this big hub of oil platforms. So we were trying to see if there was a difference in their migration. Did they actually bump out a little bit because of the noise, or the idea was the noise was causing them to move their migration patterns. So I did like a study, I was part of the study that did the analytics for that, which was really cool.
Yeah, that's really special. So what were the results?
What was the result? That's a good question. It actually, they couldn't actually place it towards the noise of that, because there was another study afterwards that was doing it, but there was definitely a movement in the actual migration. So instead of it being just a straight migration, so it would go in a fairly straight pattern when they all migrated, and then it would bump out a little bit, and it was right around the area with these platforms. So they knew the platform was there. We couldn't directly prove that it was noise. There was another study that did it after I left that had actually like acoustic monitoring. Remember those Dopplers I was talking about, but these were placed underwater, and they had like an upward facing instrument, and they would actually track the noise. But I don't remember the results of that.
Okay.
But noise definitely affects marine mammals. We know that for sure. It's just, how does it affect it, and what are the mitigation strategies? How do we adapt to that in terms of the oil and gas kind of thing?
Right. So, that's a huge thing right now, particularly with experimental sites, and even shipping right now is kind of a big thing with oil.
Oh, huge.
With whales. So,
absolutely, especially with the northern white whales. Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
You know what? I found out why it's called the right whale. Do you know why it's called the right whale?
I think you're going to prove me wrong if I answer it. So I don't know.
Okay, so this is what I've heard. You know what? I probably should have Googled it, but sometimes it's more fun just to call it. So they are the right whale because they are the right size and the right speed for people to harpoon. That's why they call them the right whale.
That's interesting.
Right?
Very interesting.
Why?
How ironic, right? An endangered species.
Well, they got right. They were almost wiped out, and that's why.
Exactly. Interesting.
So what did you hear?
Well, I mean, I just assumed it had to do with their body structure, so their size, but I didn't know it was the right size. I thought it had to do with like maybe they're right facing or something like that. I don't know. But,
no.
I would never have guessed that.
Pretty sure they're fairly symmetrical. It's that they were the right whale to hunt. That's why they're called the right whale. It's kind of crazy.
I feel like we need to change their name now, because that's such a negative connotation on their name.
Kind of is.
Maybe we should say the saved whale, because
the
we're hoping to save it.
Not so endangered whale.
Not so endangered, yeah. The whale we saved. Something like that. Hopefully that'll be true soon enough.
I love it.
Yeah. So
whales.
Yeah, exactly. So I did that. I did consulting for a while. I actually got laid off from that position when the recession hit. Oil and gas took a dip. The company's sort of contracts took a dip, and I was one of the last ones on, and one of the first ones to go. So that was a bit of a shock. I did consulting on my own for a bit, because I did have some of my own clients over that time that were more dredging related and more locally related. So I didn't really get the marine stuff. I was hoping to do a little bit of consulting. I did for like the federal government a little bit at that point on some conservation stuff and some GIS stuff, which was kind of nice, but not enough to survive on my own, to pay the mortgage. We had kids at that point, pay for schooling and extracurricular activities and sports and stuff like that. It was a little difficult. At that time when they were younger, we put them in Montessori. We wanted to pay for schooling. So I started looking for more jobs. I got a government job, the federal government job. And here in Burlington, where I live, just west of Toronto, there's a government building, a very prestigious science government building. It has Environment Canada and Department of Fisheries and Oceans. And I worked there for 6 years as a GIS analyst at one point, also just they call it a biologist too, where I was a biologist for the Great Lakes Laboratory. research laboratory, and it was fantastic. I loved that job. Worked there for 6 years, got to do a lot of cool studies on endangered species or species at risk. For the species at risk back here in Canada, I got to work on a binational agreement between the U.S. and Canada about the Great Lakes, and looking at sort of like a nearshore framework, which would be how do we protect the near shore of the Great Lakes. And essentially what happened is people in the government decided, when people go to the coastline of Lake Ontario, Lake Erie, Lake Superior, Lake Huron, Michigan, they look out and they don't want to see green. They don't want to see pollution. They want to see health. They want to see a healthy ecosystem. So they wanted this nearshore framework to essentially make sure that the coastline, that as far as you can see, is healthy. And that's how it kind of came to be. It wasn't really a scientific consensus or anything like that. It was more of, hey, citizens of the U.S. and Canada want to make sure the Great Lakes are healthy as far as they can see. So how do we do that? And I think they're still working on it now, to be honest. That was just the beginning stages of it, and I got to work on that. So I got to work on a lot of really interesting projects. Some of the projects I got to work on were not as interesting, but still important. We started to create a geographic database for the Central and Arctic region in Canada. That's the office that I worked at. So it included Ontario, the prairies provinces, so Manitoba, Saskatchewan, Alberta, and the Arctic. And what we did is took all the data from all the scientists that had data on their computers, and we put it all into a database, or we tried to. And that was interesting because there was a lot of people, have their own ways of handling data and storing data. A lot of it's on Excel sheets, buried in files and folders. But it's important data. It's millions and millions of dollars worth of data. And what was happening is when the scientists were leaving, all that data would either disappear or nobody would do anything with it. So we were like, that's an important data for the future. So we wanted to digitize it all, make it into a map form, and store it into a geographic database. And so that's what we did. That's what I did. So it was a lot of just database and going through data and interviewing scientists to find out what data they had, trying to convince them that, hey, just because you give us data doesn't mean we're going to share it with anybody. It's still for you. We just want to make sure that it's safe, and that if your computer crashes, we don't have to worry about it.
Yeah.
Or the network crashes, we don't have to worry about it. So that was interesting.
That's
Not
a really
as
good.
exciting.
That's a good highlight though, because you had this goal of like cleaning up a water body, right? And your method wasn't necessarily to go out like you did in the Gulf of Mexico and like physically take the samples with using CGTs and equipment. Your method was to preserve data. So you always had a baseline of kind of where you were and where you're going. And it's an important part of conservation. And you weren't necessarily out in the field doing it. So I wanted to highlight that.
Yeah. No, thank you.
That is very valuable.
Absolutely. I think a lot of people get confused by that. Most of the people, like if you look, when I looked into marine protected areas, working in that field, a lot of the work had to do with how good of a workshop can you put on? Because when you plan and design a marine protected area, you're bringing stakeholders together. That could be the science community, that could be government, that could be industry, that could be fishing. Whoever has a stake in the ocean that you're trying to plan, they want to be a part of the conversation. So you have to bring them together. And I remember at one point I interviewed for a job in marine protected areas within the government. I didn't get it, but I interviewed for the job. And one of the aspects of it was one of the tests one of the questions on a test that you had to write was prioritize how you would plan, prioritize these tasks. And it was a list of about 10 to 15 tasks on how you would plan a workshop. And I'm sitting here, I'm like, I just want to do MPA work. I don't want to plan a workshop. I don't have to order food that people will like, or make sure that it's gluten-free, or make sure that it's not, it's okay for people who have peanut allergies. I don't want to do that. I want to be involved in the conversation. But that was the MPA work that was done. And a lot of people don't realize when you get these big announcements of, the largest MPA ever, or in Canada, we just put in 2 MPAs in the Arctic. Well, a lot of that work wasn't done in the field. A lot of that work was done in these closed-door rooms with sandwiches and drinks and maybe a cookie for a snack so you can get that little sugar rush, and people just talking and getting people together and battling it out and compromising and stuff. And it's all behind closed doors. It's all in this meeting room in a hotel somewhere that's maybe middle ground for a lot of people, or that's in the local area to get the local people involved, and that's what marine protected area planning is all about, which you don't think about that.
No.
You think about marine protected areas, you're on the sea all the time, and some of them are like that, some of the local ones are, but the larger ones are all done in like, in rooms full of people trying to sort of argue their stake and compromise of what they can take and what they can't.
Mm-hmm. And certainly, the work that's done in the field comes to play in these meetings, but to be able to have the skills to sit at the table and actually, chat about it intelligibly and make your case is incredibly valuable.
Absolutely. Like, you got to realize that science is just one aspect of the entire conservation sort of field. The scientists go out and collect the data. The technicians and their teams go out and collect the data, which is super important. But then it goes up the ladder. It gets analyzed by maybe the scientists and their team, and then it goes to the policy people, and they make the decision based on the data. So when you hear terms like science-based decision making, that's the science that's collected out in the field is brought to you, and then it's analyzed in a certain way, and a lot of times it's shown in map form, and with different zones and stuff, and you're like, okay, now I can make decisions based on these. I got to read this map and make a decision, or read a set of maps and make a decision based on the data that's in front of me. So it's not just marine biologists that are involved in this. There are marine policy analysts, there's politicians, there's managers and superiors and supervisors and all this kind of stuff that goes into it before an MPA is actually designed. And that's a lot with any kind of legislation, decision. You get a lot of people looking at it and making decisions. The data is super important. It's part of the process, but it's not, it's just the beginning of the process.
Right. And that's really what MPAs are. They are a legislative decision, because after that they require, ideally some sort of regulation. Certainly it takes, that legislation to make that distinction and that designation of a marine protected area.
Yeah, absolutely. And there's different types of sort of that kind of process, depending on if it's local or federal.
Right.
There are a lot of local MPAs that are community managed, which is similar. They're enforced by the community, but maybe not put in law as a law in terms of the country that's found. It's more of the community fishes. They need to make sure they have fish for the future, so they govern themselves, and they enforce themselves. And so that works well. That actually works a little better and a little faster because they don't have to go as high. And
right. And then you don't have to have the red tape. You all
exactly.
But I think that's really admirable, because I think it's difficult for people to agree. For
sure.
Entire communities, particularly, fishing communities can be sometimes a little bit or very competitive.
Yep.
So they want to make sure that, like, well, if I stop fishing, is that guy really going to stop fishing? So that there are communities out there that are doing this.
Absolutely. And then you've got countries like, when the Ross Sea MPA in Antarctica was designated a few years ago, that's managed by 24 countries, right? Because it's Antarctica.
Right.
Including Russia and China, which have a huge fishing stake in there. So imagine the difficulty, comparing just local fishing communities within the same village to 24 countries who have histories of wars and economic sanctions and all this kind of stuff with each other. And they still both of them were able to, like, both scales are able to pass a marine protected area. It's absolutely phenomenal.
It really is. It truly is. So, people skills.
Very
valuable, y'all.
Absolutely.
How did you start your own podcast? How did you start your community?
Yeah. So this is something that's always, that always interested me, because I was, and it had to do a lot with where I was, because I was a marine biologist in Ontario, and because I was working in fresh water at the government. Actually, it was before the government. I started Speak Up for Blue the year the BP oil spill happened.
Was it because of the BP oil spill, or was that like a coincidence?
It was a coincidence.
Okay.
I had been looking at it I've been going back and forth on the idea for a while. And at this point I had just been laid off from my consultancy job. I was kind of consulting on the side, like consulting for myself. But I had a lot of free time because I wasn't as busy as I would be with a job. So I decided, I was telling my wife, I was like, I want to just kind of put a news website together, because what was happening is I was talking to friends, and I have friends. I'm very fortunate that I have friends from all different sort of cultural backgrounds and professional backgrounds, and I'd say 90% of them did not know what was going on in the ocean. And they would ask me questions because they didn't know. And it wasn't necessarily their fault in terms of they didn't know because they were just ignorant or they didn't care. They just didn't know because they weren't looking it up, or they didn't know where to look it up, on the internet or something.
I also think it's a phenomenon that if you are not specifically looking for a specific topic, or ocean news, for example, it doesn't stumble across your, it may not stumble across your feed because there's so much information out there. That's right. To know.
You're right. And well, it's true. And it's actually interesting. The ones that do pop up that are marine related in the mainstream media are usually like shark bites or shark incidences, or like a boat or fisheries, every once in a while, maybe seafood every once in a while, or at the time, like aquaculture was a big thing. But when the BP oil spill happened, I went to Oceans Week in Washington, D.C. And that happens every year. And it's government that gets together. And at this point, it was government talking about the oil spill. And so people were freaking out because it was ongoing. Like, it was in June. The BP oil spill happened in April,
right?
It was, people were still freaking out, and they were showing pictures. I'll never forget. I saw Dr. Carl Safina, great, not only a great scientist but great advocate for the ocean. And it was really, this is really like the BP oil spill happened. Something happened when the BP oil spill happened. I think social media really got introduced to marine biology, because what was happening, I don't know if you noticed it too, but what was happening is you had Carl Safina, you had Dr. J. Nichols, you had Sylvia Earle, Dr. Sylvia Earle, go down to the Gulf of Mexico and start taking pictures. Carl Safina actually rented out a plane to fly over the BP oil spill and filmed what was happening. And he did a presentation at Ocean Week, and he was talking about a dolphin that he came across when he was on a boat. And the dolphin was covered in oil. And he said he said the dolphin basically came over to him, almost looked like he was asking for help.
Oh, gosh.
And I'll never forget it, because Carl just started to cry in front of a room full of professionals. He just broke down, not like sobbing, but there were tears coming out of it as he was talking about this story. And it really showed that we were in trouble, and I went home, and people they knew about the BP oil spill, but they didn't really know about the effects as to the level that I knew. I had a lot of conversations with scientists that had firsthand knowledge of it, that were down there. They saw the tar balls already starting to come up. They spoke to, fishermen that couldn't go out and fish in the Gulf of Mexico anymore. It was just, all the different, the underlying stories that were happening that weren't necessarily getting covered by the media, but was getting covered by certain parts of social media. And at that point, that kind of really got me onto the website, the Speak Up for Blue. I went to another conference later on that summer in Canada. It was Coastal Zone Canada. And at the end of that conference, somebody stood up and they said, look, we're just preaching to the choir here. All these studies that we're talking about this conference are great, but nobody in the public really knows about them. We had a few people from the public attend some of them, but nobody really knew what was going on, and they never will, because we never get it out to the public. And that just, the light bulb went off, the aha moment went off, and I said, well, I got to do this. It's up to me to, I felt it was up to me to start telling the stories that the scientists saw. My fellow colleagues that we would see on a daily basis. I didn't see it because I wasn't out in the field all the time, but I had seen it before when I was in the Gulf of Mexico.
Right. You had seen it, and you have that direct line.
Exactly.
And I really love that you took that responsibility. Big thing is to be the change you want to see.
Exactly.
And you took that on.
Yeah, well, thank you. I mean, it was one of the things where I didn't know what I was really getting into, but I was just like, I got to start this somewhere. So I started a website 4 months later as I was planning it out. Didn't know anything about websites or WordPress or anything like that, design or anything like that. And then I got it up and running, and I started to write. And I was trying to write a story every day while working a job. Having 2 kids wasn't working at all. I'm not a great writer. But as you can tell, I love to talk about marine conservation and marine science. So about 2 or 3 years later, after I started this blog, I started to get into podcasts. And that's when I started to say, okay, this is where it's going to come out. And actually, I started a YouTube channel right before I did podcasting, and on advice of a friend. And then I got in, the video aspect was really taking up a lot of time for me. I didn't really have a lot of time to do that kind of stuff. I didn't really have the camera work, like the actual camera to do it that would look good. So I just didn't continue it. Then I discovered podcasting, and I started listening to podcasts. And I was like, well, I wonder if there's podcasts on marine science, marine conservation. And there wasn't really an active one. There was Naked Scientists, or Naked Oceans, they called it, for the Naked Scientist people, that had a good one, but they weren't continuing it for whatever reason. And so I was like, well, as someone who took up, I got to get it to the public. Well, it's time for me now to, do a podcast on marine conservation. And then it was born. I took about a year to kind of figure everything out, do a bunch of interviews, and I released in June 2015, and I've been doing it ever since.
That's awesome. And it's a really awesome podcast. So
Thank you.
Initially, you weren't doing it every day initially, right?
No, it was once a week. It was one interview, because I want to tell the stories of certain scientists that would never really get access to mainstream media, and people that I knew, a lot of people that I knew. I did it once a week for about.
That sounds familiar.
Yeah. Well, I mean, but those were the stories that people were interested in. And actually, I noticed a lot of times when I did those, when I first started coming out of those, a lot of people have, I always heard that a lot of people, think scientists are these elitist type people, but I never really heard anybody say it that weren't scientists. We thought about it as scientists, that we weren't liked because we were saying, no, you can't do this, you can't do this, you can't do that. Right. But I never really heard anybody. And then I started to get feedback from people, because the interviews that I would do, and it's kind of like what you're doing now, is I would talk about how they got into marine biology, how they got to the position that they're in. And so you get that story from them, and you almost, you almost fall in love with that story. And it just, you can maybe, like, if somebody struggled through their career, they understand the struggles, they understand how career paths change, or whatever the story is, they may sort of connect with that and connect with the person. So I started to get feedback from people being like, wow, scientists are really cool people. They're kind of fun. Like they struggle. You guys are making a lot of money, but you love what you do, and you've had some great experiences. I'm really starting to like these scientists. I thought you guys, were really bad people. I'm not going to swear on this podcast, but they had names for us. And I was like, yeah, well, I'm glad that I was able to sort of, bust that myth, because a lot of the people that I know are great people. They're not elitist. They're not snobby.
Right. And I think that marine scientists particularly just have like a special brand of cool. Might be a little biased, but pretty much everybody I've met is pretty awesome.
Well, let's be honest. When you go to a function or a party, say a dinner party or anybody, and you meet somebody new, and they say, well, what do? And you say, well, I'm a marine biologist. People are like, the first answer, there's a couple answers that you're going to get. One, I've always wanted to be a marine biologist. When I was a kid, I wanted to be a marine biologist. The other is, like George Costanza from Seinfeld, and I might be too old for that reference in terms of, I'm not sure what your audience is like, but Seinfeld was a sitcom, and there was an episode where one of the characters said he was a marine biologist and had to get a golf ball unstuck from a whale. But go back and watch that episode. But I get that a lot as well. Yeah. Have you not heard of that? Have you not seen that episode?
If I have, it's been a really long time.
It's been a long time. Okay. Well, I'll email that to you, the number, the season of the number. But it was one of the most iconic sort of marine biologist sitcom episodes I've ever seen, and I always get asked about it. And so so you get those kind of answers, and so people love you when people like what you do, and they're interested in what you do.
This is very true.
They ask a lot of questions when it happens, right?
This is true. This is why I started a podcast about it.
Exactly. But yeah, so the podcast, I started off with once a week. I fell in love with podcasting and talking. And I had a guy who actually said, hey, I want to volunteer and I want to help you out with the podcast. And I was like, well, this is great. I'm like, how much time can you dedicate? So what I did is for every podcast that I did show notes. And that was once a week. So I put it up on my blog. And then Nathan came in and said, okay, I'm going to write everything for you because I love writing. And I'm just going to listen to your podcast. So all you have to do is just record, edit, and post, and I'll do the rest. I'm like, fantastic. And then I said, hey, do you want to be on the podcast? And so I did 5 days a week. And on Friday, we had this episode called Ocean Talk Fridays, where Nathan and I would pick out about 4 or 5 stories. At this point, the episodes were about an hour long, and we would do an episode. We would just talk about these different stories and what we liked about them. It was actually quite fun. A lot of people liked it, and there's been some requests to bring it back. Nathan got a job, another job that's really, really busy. So unfortunately, I can't bring him back, and I feel bad bringing somebody else on to talk about it. But it may come back at some point. But that went on for like a year or two. The 5 days a week went on for about 6 or 7 months, and then it was like working a job again with kids. Trying to have a full life. It just wasn't working. So I went to 3 days a week, where one episode would be sort of like an editorial on the Monday, which would be me just talking about stuff. The Wednesday would be an interview, and the Friday would be Ocean Talk Friday. And then I did that for about 2.5 years. And then about a year and a half ago, July 2018, I was at an International Marine Conservation Congress in Malaysia. And I decided, I'm going to cover this. I covered the previous conference through the podcast with a bunch of interviews. This time I want to cover it myself. I wanted to just do like, what was the day like, and maybe do a couple of interviews. And so I actually posted every day while I was at the conference. And I was like, you know what, this is really cool. I didn't have a job at that point. I'd quit my job. And I'll tell you that in a second, but I quit my job. So I decided, you know what, after the conference, I'm going to go 7 days a week. And I've done 7 days a week, where I miss a few days here and there since then. So for about a year and a half. Which has grown the podcast quite a bit. We're almost at 1 million downloads. We're about 920,000 downloads.
That's incredible.
It's quite almost 930 downloads right now. 930,000.
Such a milestone.
Such a milestone. Almost at 1,000 episomes too. I'm 911 episodes as of today. When we record this.
Are you planning the 1,000th episode party yet?
I was thinking of it, but I don't know what to do with it, and I don't know how to do it, and I don't know if it's going to be a big party. It might just be me in my office really running around and be like, I got 1 million downloads. I don't know. The life of a podcaster is. It would be kind of cool to throw a party. I just don't know when it's going to happen. It's going to happen probably in the new year sometime, but I'm not too sure.
Virtual party. Like a Zoom date with everybody, or like a Facebook Live, because you can't see other people.
Well, I think a Facebook Live would be cool, like using some sort of like live software where I could get multiple guests on that I've had over, like do like a 12-hour day, just like a marathon and have like yourself, other podcasters, people who've been on the episode before. And talk about the good, like bring Nathan back that did Ocean Talk Friday, and just talk about just go on a marathon run for the 1,000th episode, and hopefully the 1,000th episode will coincide with the 1 million downloads. So I'm thinking something like that.
That'd be really cool.
That would be amazing if I could do that. That would be awesome. But that's a lot of planning, so we'll see how that goes. But yeah, I mean, the thing is that the reason why I continue with the podcast, one is I love it, and I've been able to build this community that have been very engaging and responsive. My listeners, I like, as you may already know too, I know you just started this podcast, but you're probably hearing from a lot of people, and it's amazing to see. The podcast started off of just telling allowing other people to tell their stories, like building a platform where other scientists can tell their stories. Then it really turned into people wanted action items to do. So I start to give them action items, and I go over things, and I become vulnerable because I can't do all of these things. And so I talk to different people about their experiences, and it's been amazing and really a life learning experience. And when I hear back from people to say, like, I had a friend in Hong Kong who listened to the podcast quite often, and they didn't have recycling in her building. And she said, we have recycling depots. So her boyfriend and her at the time grabbed the recycling from their place, collected it, and then brought it down to the depot. Now, if you look at it, like in Hong Kong, the life, I mean, obviously it's different right now with all the protests, but Hong Kong is a lot of huge buildings. You're bringing trash or recycling through those buildings, like 40 stories down.
Wow.
Bring it across the street off those busy streets and bring it to a depot. That had a profound effect on me. And I keep hearing these types of stories. And then it gets to the point, I was actually just at Duke University last week, and I spoke to a longtime listener, and she had never contacted me before, but I met her there, and she said, hey, I want to let you know what your podcast did for you. And this is not me tooting my own horn. This is me being very humble about myself. But she said that she was doing a PhD, and between her undergrad and PhD, she was kind of lost. She was kind of stuck, and she was working at an oyster. She had a job where she was basically working on oysters all day, and it was cold. It was rainy sometimes, and it was hard work. She would cut herself from working with these oysters, and she would put on, when she got really down herself, she would put on her earbuds and listen to the Speak Up for Blue podcast, and it would get her through it. Like stuff like that.
It keeps you going.
It keeps me going. It made my week.
Side note for anybody listening, we love hearing from listeners.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Even if it's stuff that maybe I did wrong or you didn't like, I still love hearing that because it allows me to improve. Because I don't want to annoy everybody. I'm not gonna conform to everybody's way of that they think I should do the podcast. But there are some people who say, "Hey, I wish you'd done this," or "I wish you let your guests speak a little bit more," because again, I do talk a lot. And so I get that kind of feedback, and I use that feedback to sort of improve on the way I do interviews or improve on the way I conduct myself in a podcast. But when you get the positive ones, you're like, I'm done. Like this is when I started to get those, I realized my path. I realized that this is what I was designed to do. It fits all of my skill sets that I'm good at, that I feel that I'm good at. People have said that that they love hearing my voice. They love the way I host podcasts, to the point where I got job offers for doing other podcasts, and I've got job offers to produce other podcasts. I actually started a whole company, quit my job and started an entire company just to launch podcasts for other people. And it's not only in the environmental world, in the ocean world, but I do it for companies and YouTube creators and all these different crazy people that are trying to get marketing out through an audio format like a podcast and build a platform there. I'm able to do that because I found this skill that I'm good at. But the funny thing is I don't get paid for Speak Up for the Ocean Blue. I don't get paid for any of this. That's out of my own pocket. I do get sponsors every once in a while, and I have an affiliate sponsor, but it's not even close to being like a good enough salary or revenue stream to be my full-time gig.
Right.
And that's why I launched the podcast for companies. They pay me to edit, they pay me to host, and it's really helped me in my game for Speak Up for the Ocean Blue. And they kind of help each other. So I've used Speak Up for the Ocean Blue as a bit of an experiment to experiment on different styles, structures, content, platforms, microphones, all this type of stuff, so that I can be a better producer and host for other clients. But the real thing that's really done, and it's through the feedback from the people, is I realized that this is my legacy. This is how I'm able to reach people that may not have had this information for anybody else before. And I'm able to change their lives in some sort of way, even if it just makes them think a little differently.
Yeah.
One of my tagline is live for a better ocean. And so if you think about your ocean on any kind of task daily task that you do, whether it be making your lunch in the morning, going grocery shopping, and not using a plastic bag and not using single-use plastics throughout the day.
Right. Bring your own cup, bring your own water bottle.
Driving less and maybe biking if you can, doing less commute if you can. All that type of stuff, if I can make people think about that, I've done my job. And I feel like I continue to build my legacy. Not getting paid as a career, mind you, but I'm still have that satisfaction that I'm still a marine biologist. I'm still a marine conservationist, and I'm still doing marine conservation. I'm doing it from a larger platform than I would have ever had working for the government. And I'm reaching the public, which I feel is the most important aspect of marine conservation, is to be able to change behaviors based on information that they use. And I'm still exploring how to do behavior change. I'm working with a great woman by the name of Brooke Tully, who used to be in commercial marketing, and now she's in conservation marketing. I'm playing a big role or bigger and bigger role in Society of Conservation Biology's working group of social and marketing conservation. It's changed really the way I've approached conservation from when the beginning of this conversation, I talked about how I love pure research. You're now doing research on communication and behavior change, and using my audience as a way, because they're the ones I'm trying to change their behavior. Some of them I don't, because they align with a lot of the stuff that we do. But sometimes we just don't know what we can do until we know other people are doing it. And
Right.
we know that community, right? So that's what's so great. I don't get paid for what I'm doing here. And I might even find a job at one point that's completely out of marine conservation, but I'm always going to have the podcast.
And then
right?
always keep your foot in the door with it. And like you said, it's your legacy, and it's a beautiful thing to provide for everybody. And I want to thank you for it, because I think your podcast is fantastic. I do listen
Well,
to
thank
it.
you.
You've got a lot of great stuff on it now. I like that you kind of break things down, ocean news, and it's wonderful. So thank you for what you do.
Thank you. I appreciate that. You bet. Well, I want to thank you too for actually starting a podcast. I'm a huge advocate. I've presented at conferences before on people should be starting more of a podcast, because as you know, this is a great platform to teach people. People listen to podcasts longer. They listen to during their commute, walking the dog, just being outside on a hike, wherever, working out. They use it as an opportunity to learn. And there's 750,000 podcasts in the store and growing in the Apple podcast store, and of course Spotify and all these other platforms that have been
iHeartRadio and your favorite podcast player.
Exactly. Exactly. And but the funny thing is like I've always been an advocate of more people starting ocean related podcasts.
Yes.
And I remember being asked a question at one of the conferences, and they're like, well, isn't that competition for you? And I'm like, yes. And I'm like, I want them to compete. I want everybody who starts a podcast in marine conservation to do better, because you're reaching potentially a different audience, potentially an overlapping audience, but you're reaching more audience members. We're getting the word out there. We may have different styles. We may have different approaches. Like within the Speak Up for Blue network, we have 6 podcasts.
Right.
We have Speak Up for the Ocean Blue. We have Marine Conservation Happy Hour, which is like talking marine conservation issues with 2 other people while we drink. There's Conciencia Azul, which is the Speak Up for Blue podcast hosted by Melissa Marquez, but in Spanish. We have a Dugongs and Sea Dragons, which is a Dungeons and Dragons game based on marine conservation, which is done by a number of marine conservationists and scientists in the field that you've heard on this podcast before. Or on my podcast. And then we have the Marine Mammal Society has done a podcast that we are in charge of, and that's the Marine Mammal Science Podcast. And then we have the Association of Environmental Studies and Sciences, which is a podcast we call Environmental Studies and Sciences. We're very creative with those 2 names, by the way. But they started recently in September. We just launched those podcasts. So we've had 6 podcasts, in the past 4 years that have been released that are all ocean related, and they all have their own sort of angle to it, just like you. So you want to be a marine biologist. You started because you wanted to answer the question that people would ask you multiple times. And so you're answering it all in one, but you're also bringing in other people's experiences that are in marine biology, marine conservation, what have you. So there's lots of room for people to start a podcast. There's lots of room for people to start blogs. The thing is we just need to do more of it. I'm a huge advocate of science communication, especially for marine science, because people don't know.
People don't know.
Yeah, if you look at your 5 closest friends that are not marine biologists, they probably don't know everything that you do about marine science, which could have an impact on our decision making, which could have an impact on the way we vote. Yep. I've been talking a lot about the Canadian election the last couple of days because we just had it on Monday. And, that, in my opinion, that was a vote for the environment. There was, in Canada, there's the Liberal Party, the Conservative Party, and there's a couple of other parties, but those 2 are usually form some sort of government, whether it be a majority or a minority. The biggest difference between those parties was the Conservatives did not have a true climate change plan. The rest of the parties, the Liberals, the New Democratic Party, the Green Party, even the Bloc Québécois Party, which is a Quebec separatist party, had a climate change plan because they realized that it's affecting their culture and affecting their province. Because they have an Arctic component to their province and a southern component in the St. Lawrence River. That is a super important part. So if the Conservatives got power, our environmental degradation would have hit scales that we couldn't even think of. It happened last time the Conservatives had power. They deregulated a lot of our best environmental regulations for pipelines and oil and gas, and they would have done this exact same thing right now. luckily the Liberals got a minority government. They'd been in power. They had a majority for the last 4 years. Now they got a minority government. And they have to team up with another party to form sort of an actual government that could pass bills, which are more environmentally friendly. So now we're really going to see we're really going to see a country that's going to embrace environmental change, embrace climate change reduction, and I think even more than what the Liberals were doing, because they're a little bit centered that they bought a pipeline, so they weren't the best. They did a lot of stuff for the environment, but not all of it. So you have a lot of these types of components that, being able to speak to people about the environment and being able to reach people through a podcast helps with how they're informed they are to vote.
Right. And I think you bring up a really good point with voting. People don't often correlate like their knowledge of the oceans and, the things that they learn to translate into voting. It does matter. It really matters.
Absolutely, it matters. I mean, you look at, the Obama administration compared to the Trump administration, it's night and day.
Right.
To the point where the Obama administration declared climate change their number one threat in the U.S. Even the Navy said it. And then you get the Trump administration that doesn't even believe climate change is a human problem, is a human cause problem. Right. That's a big difference in how policies are going to get made. Right. Bringing coal back, all that kind of stuff. I don't have to go on because I'm sure the listeners know, but it makes a difference. So, come 2020, as we approach 2020, you're going to see my podcast really start to focus on a lot of the environmental regulation changes that have happened over the past 4 years, to inform people that, look, I'm not trying to say whether you should vote for Republican or Democrat. What I'm trying to inform you is all the change that are done. And if environment is important to you, you're going to vote for the environment at that point.
Mm-hmm.
And that's the point of the podcast, is to inform people to make those changes. So you can make very large changes through your vote, and you can make very small changes through your daily routine.
It's true. It's very true. Thank you for that.
No problem.
So we got really
way over
there. Yeah. So no, you're fine. It was good. I thought it was really good points you brought up. But I have a couple lighthearted questions that I would like to ask.
Okay.
And then before we end. So, what is your favorite field story or stories to tell? And I feel like you probably have one from living on a boat for 8 months. And this could be, the best day in the field, everything went right, you saw dolphins, most amazing day. 2, everything went wrong, and I don't even know how I'm here right now, but it's a great story right now. So we all have each of those days. That's just the nature of field work.
Yeah.
But what is your favorite?
I think my favorite was I was a marine mammal when I was consulting. I was a marine mammal observer in the Arctic. Mm-hmm. And one of the best days was when you're up in the summer. It's 23 and a half hours of sun, and so I actually worked the night shift. So the reason why, so we had a night and day shift, even though there was no night, but we had a night and day shift because we had to do a 24-hour watch. I decided to take the night for 2 reasons. One, I wanted to kind of witness the all sun all the time kind of thing. It was about 15 degrees Celsius, which is a perfect sort of fall weather. So it was kind of nice to be outside in the sunny kind of weather, barely any clouds most of the time. It was absolutely beautiful. The water was perfectly slick. I just got to experience that whole Arctic experience. And I remember at one time, it was probably around like 2:00 in the morning, still quite sunny. We're monitoring for marine mammals. We had to shut the equipment down. It's seismic equipment. I won't go into the details of why, but it has to do with noise. There were marine mammals around us, but we hadn't seen them in about 20 minutes. And we had to wait till they popped up to see if they were out of the bounds that we could turn on the instrumentation again. And all of a sudden, I just look over to the port side and I just say, oh my God. And it was this massive, 60, 65-foot bowhead whale that just kind of came out for a breath. And it came out of nowhere, but right beside our boat, and just kind of went up, and I saw the entire fluke, the entire tail just go right down. It was like the perfect sight. Of course, too fast for any kind of photography or anything like that.
You have to take the mental picture.
Exactly. But it was one of my best moments out in the field. It was absolutely stunning, and I'll never forget it.
That's special.
Yeah.
It's always special seeing huge megafauna like that up close.
Mm-hmm.
So to carry on with that, then what is your favorite sea creature?
Oh, my favorite sea creature is the cuttlefish. I think,
Why?
well, for one, I find them fascinating. The body type, especially sort of, in the mollusca phylum, in the taxonomic sort of category that they're in. You have squid, you have octopus, and then you have these cuttlefish, and they're kind of like a little bit in the middle of both of those species in terms
They
of
are.
evolutionary scale, and they just have a really cool look to them. Their camouflage is absolutely amazing, and I experienced it firsthand. I was in Jamaica on a trip. It wasn't science related. It was just a trip we were on. We were in one of the most spectacular sort of cottage type places in like where the Blue Lagoon was shot. And it was just, I was in the water. I was coming out of a snorkel trip with my friend. My friend came out first. We have a dock that was headed to our cottage, and I was about to come up on the ladder, and I see something out on the left-hand side of me. This is my peripheral, and I kind of look, and nothing is there. And I look back up. I start climbing up, and I see a little flash, and I was like, what's going on? And I sat in the water, and I looked out, and over time I could see there was about a dozen cuttlefish lined up in a line looking at me. But every time I looked, they would camouflage themselves, so it was really hard to see. And it was almost like a bit like the movie The Predator, where you can kind of see the outline of it, but you're not too sure if there's something there. And then they would turn like bright pink, then bright red, and then they would go again. They would go, transparent again or something. And I sat there probably for another hour and a half, and they sat there looking at me, and I sat there looking at them. I didn't move. I didn't swim around them. I didn't want to disturb them. And then finally they swam off after about an hour and a half. And I remember getting up, and I almost had tears in my eyes. And my wife was just like, what's wrong with you? I'm like, there were a dozen cuttlefish just staring at me. We had like a staring contest for the last hour and a half because they expected me to come up. They were asking me to come up, and I just said, no, leave me alone. I'm happy, and I'm in my happy place.
Yeah.
And so it was quite the experience. So I've always had a sort of a soft spot for cuttlefish just because of that.
Yeah, they chose you.
Yeah, exactly. I was one of them.
Oh, that's such a cool experience. Thank you for sharing that.
You bet.
All right, as we wrap up, there's so much more I want to chat with you about, so you definitely have to come on the podcast again.
I would love to.
Awesome. So as we wrap up, I love to provide an action item for people. So, and we chatted a little bit about this before the podcast. So what do you have for the audience?
It has to do with careers. I mean, this is essentially, you want to be a marine biologist.
Right.
I want to warn people. It's not easy to become a marine biologist. And I mean, you can go to school for marine biology.
Mm-hmm.
And if you can afford the tuition and you enjoy what you do, by all means, go ahead. But keep in mind, whether you're an undergraduate, a graduate, like with a master's, or a graduate with a PhD, or you come out as an undergraduate and you have experience and you volunteer and everything, it's not easy to get a job. There are a lot more people who are doing marine biology, and there's a lot less funding than there used to be. And jobs are not as secure as they used to be. And I'm not trying to talk people out of it. I'm just preparing people that you can't just go about your business and apply to jobs when you want, and get the job that you want necessarily without doing extra work. Be prepared to do what you need to do to separate yourself out from everybody else. And on that note too, is you don't have to have a career in marine biology to do marine biology.
Mm-hmm.
Like I mentioned previously,
particularly marine conservation.
Exactly. I have a podcast on marine conservation. I don't get paid for it. It satisfies my passion for what I'm doing. And I'll tell you, it was a big struggle, quitting a scientific job at the federal government where I had a pension, where I had benefits, where I had a bit of security, and go into an entrepreneurial type of life.
Mm-hmm.
But I am so happy I did so, because I was able to grow Speak Up for the Ocean Blue, and I was able to have a lasting impression on a number of people. And that satisfied me, to the point where I'm like, I could get a job now in business. It doesn't matter where I work. I know that I'm still staying true to marine conservation, even though it's not part of my career. Mm-hmm. And so I want people to sort of feel that way. Don't feel the pressure that you need to get a job. By all means, if you want to be a part of your career, go ahead. Be prepared to do extra work, like volunteer, help out at conferences to plan conferences, start a podcast, start a YouTube channel. We don't have YouTube. We have maybe 1 or 2 YouTube channels, including myself, that really talk about marine conservation, marine science. We don't have anymore. Start a YouTube channel. Do that microblogging through Instagram. Talk about oceans. Don't worry about competitors. Yes, people are doing it, but go ahead and do it because it's important. We need to get that out there. Plus, managers and hiring managers will see this and say, this person's really interesting. And one thing that I'll say right before I finish here is that Nathan, the guy who did Ocean Talk Friday with me, he works for Oceana right now. And one of the, I still to this day believe that one of the reasons why he works at Oceana was because he volunteered his own time, 10 or 15 hours a week to do the podcast with me, prepare all the stuff and do that work, promote it. And that showed his dedication to marine conservation. And when you apply to a marine conservation organization like that, they like to see that because they like to see that you're really in it. You're not just going through the motions. You're really in it and dedicated to that life. So if you are dedicated to that life, do something extra while you're waiting to get a job. People will notice it. They check your social profile now, and they'll notice what you're saying. Say good stuff, be positive. Don't be negative on anybody. But it's a really important thing is to go above and beyond because there are so many more people applying to jobs where there are less jobs than there were before.
Absolutely. That was good, hard-hitting advice, but
it's a little rough to hear, but that's what I needed to hear when I was just starting out.
Very good. Well, thank you so much. So if listeners want to, where's the best place to find you? I feel like we listed 600 different places.
Well, go to speakupforblue.com. If you go to speakupforblue.com, there's all ways you can contact me. I'm on Twitter. I'm on Instagram @speakupforblue. Of course, listen to my podcast after you listen to all of this So You Want to Be a Marine Biologist podcast. But go to my podcast, subscribe. We have a number of them. If you just search any podcast app, Speak Up for Blue, that's what we go by for our authorship, and you'll be able to find all the different ones that we're a part of. And start learning. Contact me by any means, by any of those means. Direct message me or whatever you need to do. There's always ways to do it, but start by listening to my podcast so you get to know me.
Awesome. Thank you, Andrew. And I will put a link to the show notes for everybody, or I will put a link to everything that you just mentioned in the show notes for all the listeners.
Awesome. I appreciate that.
Well, thank you so much for being on, Andrew. This was awesome. I really appreciate your time.
I had a blast.
What you do.
Thank you. I had a blast. I appreciate it.
Hey y'all, Kara here. Really quickly, I found the Seinfeld Marine Biologist episode that Andrew talked about. There's a link in the show notes over at marinebio.life/Andrew. The clip is less than 5 minutes and it's hilarious. It's definitely worth checking out. Again, it's marinebio.life/Andrew and a link to the Seinfeld episode as well as everything else we've chatted about today. Thank you for listening to today's show. I'd love to hear any insight you've gleaned. Leave a comment in the show notes or send me an email over at marinebio.life. If you enjoyed this episode, leave a review and of course, share with your friends. If you want more resources for ocean news, including conservation topics and careers, plus personal insight from me that I just don't share anywhere else, join me at marinebio.life and sign up for email updates. Keep after your dreams and making waves in your community. One person can make a difference. Thank you so much for listening, and I'll catch you next time on the So You Want to Be a Marine Biologist podcast.